we'll start back. I'd like to invite Peter Scott from the Independent Living Fund to join us, and hopefully we'll have enough time at the end if anybody's wanting to ask any questions. So if you can give a warm hand for Peter.
Hi, everybody. Okay, is it still morning? I don't know. Is it? Good morning, everybody. It's still morning. And thanks very much to Donald and SDS Scotland for the invitation to speak with you this morning. I was just remembering in preparation for this that when ILF Scotland was set up back in 2015, actually SDS Scotland did a lot of the heavy lifting, did lots of the groundwork to get the organisation established. So belated thanks, Donald, because that's why we're here today. I have to say that standing here this morning, I feel like a wee bit of a fraud. A bit of an imposter, or at least I'm here under false pretenses. The theme of the conference today is a decade of learning from the implementation of the Self-Directed Support Scotland Act. But ILF is set up under NHS legislation, not under SDS legislation. We're not covered by SDS legislation, SDS guidance, SDS anything. In fact, we're a discrete, distinct, discretionary fund. So I've not been asked here to speak about the theme of the conference, which is why I feel a wee bit kind of fraudulent. But having said that, we're reopening the Independent Living Fund next month, in April. It's just round the corner. We'll be opening the fund to new applications for the first time since 2010. And for the first time in the 36-year history of the Independent Living Fund, it will be opening within the context of SDS being the default mechanism for delivering adult social care and support. So although I'll not be talking specifically about the 10 years of SDS, the reopening of ILF will not take place in a vacuum, and there will be clear links to be made between ILF and self-directed support. So in order to feel a wee bit less of an imposter, to try and align with the theme of the conference, in addition to a quick overview of the reopening of the fund, I'll also offer some reflections on that context and relationship of SDS and ILF, the Independent Living Fund. So first of all, I think it's really important that we just take a bit of time to think about why ILF is here at all. Following the 2015 closure of ILF UK by the Westminster Government, and a year after the introduction of the SDS Act, the ILF was retained here in Scotland by the Scottish Government. And why is it that after another 9 years, and after 10 years of SDS here in Scotland, the fund's to be reopened to new applications? Why is that happening? The UK Government's announcement to close the fund was greeted with widespread anger and despair. I remember very, very clearly, as if it was yesterday, getting a distraught call from a friend in Glasgow who had just received that letter from the Independent Living Fund UK confirming the details of the closure of the fund. And she was in tears, absolutely distraught about the potential implications of that closure for her and her disabled daughter, who relied so heavily on the fund. This fear was replicated across the country, hence the vociferous campaign and the legal challenge to keep the fund. Why do disabled people, their organisations and the disability rights and independent living movement value ILF so greatly? What is it about the Independent Living Fund, which is in essence comparable to direct payments or SDS option 1, that drove people to such extreme measures as literally storming the Houses of Parliament in protest at its closure? What was it about the prospect of losing it that provoked such widespread fear and anxiety? For ILF was and it is far from perfect. For example, we charge recipients of our fund sometimes significant amounts of money for the privilege of getting the fund, and we're a relatively big public body that has all the bureaucracy that's associated with being a public body. Yet despite these and other flaws and other challenges that we have as an organisation, ILF remains highly valued by disabled people. Why is it? On the face of it, the government had a sound rationale for closing the fund. When it was set up in 1988, there was no legal basis for local authorities to give money directly to disabled people. But direct payments were introduced in 1996, and it seemed to make sense on the face of it to have all social care support funded and managed from one unified local system, rather than a dual national-local system. But this view was not shared by the disability rights and independent living movement. Why, in the context of direct payments and the introduction of SDS here in Scotland, did disabled people campaign so passionately for the creation of the Independent Living Fund in Scotland in 2015, as opposed to ILF funding being disbursed to and administered by local authorities via the well-respected and supported system of SDS, as happened in England and now in Wales? And why, once the decision was taken to create the ILF in Scotland, and we had taken over the fund from ILF UK, why did the campaigning activity shift from a focus on creating a Scottish ILF to protect it for those who already had it, to reopening the fund to new applications? Why was and is ILF so highly valued? These are questions I have asked many disabled people in recent years, including our good friend who has had lots of name checks already today, the chair of the ILF Scotland Advisory Group, Jim Elder-Woodward, who unfortunately isn't here today because he's at an ILF thing across the road. Priorities. Anyway, listen, it's not for me to speak for Jim or any disabled people for that matter at all, but I know Jim has strong views on it, and if any of you are at our parliamentary reception tonight, and I know some of you will be there, Jim will be expressing his views there directly himself. But from my perspective, I just want to give a few observations. To my embarrassment, and in response to questions about the value and importance of the Independent Living Fund, Jim often talks about himself as being one of the lucky ones. One of the lucky ones who got ILF before it closed to applications, and one of the lucky ones who kept it after 2015 because the Scottish Government created ILF Scotland. And he expresses his gratitude for having access to the life-transforming impact the fund can and does have for him. It's not for me to tell Jim anything at all, never mind how he should feel. But it is my view that disabled people like Jim should not need to express gratitude, should not feel a need to say thank you to public bodies like ILF Scotland for having their rights met, for being provided with the means to get the assistance they need to have a decent, meaningful and good life, for realising their right to participate in society as relative equals, or the right to active citizenship and to contribute to our society and our communities. They should not need to feel gratitude for having the assistance they need to overcome the barriers to independent living that our society places in their way every day. These are rights, they are human rights, that Jim and countless others have fought hard for over the decades. Overcoming these barriers to independent living and enabling a life of active citizenship is what Jim feels ILF has brought to his life. It is why Jim and so many others have campaigned to keep the ILF in Scotland, and why they have campaigned to have it reopened, even in the context of SDS, so that others could also share these benefits. Jim and many others do feel this gratitude, whether I like it or not, because ILF offers something that in theory SDS should, but in practice is not able to deliver for everyone. ILF is able to meet unmet independent living outcomes, unmet needs which largely go unrecorded, but we all know are there. Derek Feely called it the implementation gap. The Minister referred to it earlier on, and perhaps for those who access ILF, we are able to plug some of this gap. I know it's an oversimplification, but I think Jim got the message across when he said, in response to a question from the ILF board about why he values the Independent Living Fund so much, he said this: "The local authority and SDS get me up in the morning. The Independent Living Fund gives me something to get up in the morning for." What's next? Okay. So, looking back over the last decade, I think we have to recognise that self-directed support was introduced in the midst of austerity, and I fear that these two things became connected in people's minds. Public sector financial pressures meant that SDS was not delivered in the way that we all had hoped, and for many, in reality, it became synonymous with cost-cutting. It was also introduced after the closure of the Independent Living Fund to new applications, and so there was no national resource topping up local SDS budgets, which could have made a difference to the implementation. I think also that within this context of growing demand and limited resource, the principles of self-directed support have been compromised, probably inevitably. This is perhaps best illustrated by the use of enigmatic resource allocation systems and ever-tightening eligibility criteria to limit demand. When the ILF co-production group, which I'll talk a wee bit more about shortly, was first convened, one of the first contributions was a DPO request that we did not use the words eligibility criteria ever in relation to the ILF for fear of tarnishing the fund, hence our use of the term access principles. SDS, in the context of austerity and ever-tightening eligibility criteria, is not an easy sell. Also, disabled people liked the ILF UK was a national organisation covering the whole of the UK, and they like the ILF Scotland is a national organisation covering the whole of Scotland. It's therefore fully portable across the country without the need for reassessment, and it is also subject to one set of transparent operational policies, not 32 interpretations or variations. Responsibility for ILF policies sits with Scottish Government ministers, who are held accountable through regular meetings with our advisory group chaired by Jim, which I think the Minister was referencing earlier as well, and disabled people that they also like these things about the Independent Living Fund. I think there are also cultural factors at play, and perhaps critically so. ILF's singular focus and purpose is independent living. We're not distracted from this by other core responsibilities. This allows us to have a clear shared vision across the whole organisation, developed in co-production with disabled people and others. It allows us to fulfil the commitment made by the Scottish Government on creating the ILF in Scotland, that disabled people would be at the heart of the decision-making processes in the new organisation, a commitment we take very seriously. Partnership and co-production with disabled people can't be beaten. We have learned through our experience that there is simply no better way to run an organisation, always keeping a keen eye focused on independent living. And we've carried this learning, this principle and this commitment into the development of the reopening of the fund, to the best of our ability at least, and I'll return to that shortly. But just I first want to mention a wee bit about the importance of words and of language. We hear the word care talked about lots, and we've talked about it today, but many of our current fund recipients in ILF have told us that they don't need or want care. Indeed, one of our board members, who many of you will also know, Etienne Daboville, has written a book called Commissioning Independent Living, which quite deliberately does not contain the word care even once. Disabled people tell us they want assistance, personal assistance, to overcome the barriers to independent living they face every day. As SDS eligibility criteria tighten, the focus becomes increasingly on care. Substantial and critical needs are largely care-related needs. Not subject to the statutory responsibilities of local authorities, ILF is free to focus its energy and resources on independent living outcomes, and this is what we strive to do, and it is probably the key reason why the fund is so valued by people like Jim. Whilst we can and do fund personal care, this is always in the context of its necessity to enable independent living, and this is the language we try to adhere to at all times. I'm missing out some of these because I'll run out of time. So when the Scottish Government announced the reopening of the fund in its programme for government in September of last year, there was a strong commitment that the fund would be reopened through a process of co-production with key stakeholders. Many of you are in the room today. I can see several faces who have helped us on that wee journey that we've had over the last 6 months, including our hosts, SDS Scotland. So as soon as possible after the announcement, we pulled together the co-production working group. This was the wording of the announcement, just so that everybody's aware of what we're doing. Reopen the Independent Living Fund on a phased basis with an initial £9 million in 24-25 to enable up to 1,000 additional disabled people with the most complex needs to access the support they need and deserve to live independent lives. So that was the job of the co-production working group, to tell us how we were going to do that. So the group was made up of these organisations here, a pretty diverse group, I'm sure you'll agree, including a significant number of DPOs, statutory partners from COSLA, local authorities, Social Work Scotland, and a number of third sector organisations that are mentioned there. And I have to tell you that working with this group over the last six months has been a real pleasure and a real privilege for me. Reopening ILF has involved difficult choices, significant compromise, competing priorities, and our group members took them on head on. I think that this was possible because of trust. I think that disabled people and their organisations have learnt to trust ILF Scotland through our actions over the last 9 years. This put us in a really good place to work in true co-production, albeit within certain parameters out with our control, with shared responsibilities for decisions. I want to specifically acknowledge the contribution of our local authority and social work professionals who sit on the group, part of COSLA, Social Work Scotland, and frontline social workers from a number of authorities were represented on the group, and to a person they have been constructive, supportive, and genuinely excited at the prospect of having something new to offer to their most disabled citizens. I can genuinely say that the co-production group led ILF Scotland and the Scottish Government to the recommendations for reopening the fund. We did not lead the group to our recommendations. So what did the group recommend to the Minister? And the Minister has approved all of the recommendations now, by the way. So I don't have time to go through all these. The group identified these as the key issues that needed to be addressed in order to reopen the fund in the most effective way. I'm just going to highlight a few that are probably the ones that you'll be most interested in and that are key. The first one was the threshold sum. Since 1993, ILF has been accessed primarily through people meeting this thing called the threshold sum, which is essentially the amount of input or the size of your SDS budget that you get through your local authority. And there's the kind of rationale for that is that the higher the budget you have from your council, the greater the level of need you have, and ILF is intended for those with the greatest need. So it's seen as a proxy measurement of level of need. So we have decided, the group decided, in the interests of expediency, we wanted to get the fund open ASAP because we know that there's a desperate need for it out there. So we have decided, the group have decided, and the Minister's accepted, that we will continue to use this threshold sum measure as the key principle by which people will access the fund, and that threshold sum has been set initially at £800. So if someone has an SDS budget or equivalent of £800, they will be entitled to apply for ILF Scotland. The second thing I want to mention is additionality. So one of the criticisms that ILF has faced over the years, particularly since 2010 when it was closed to new applications, was that we were simply, in some cases, offsetting local authority costs. We would give money to an individual disabled person to purchase care and support or assistance that they required, and then a local authority often would reduce the amount of input they had, so there was the benefit to the individual was reduced. We talk about this thing called additionality. The reopened ILF cannot allow that to happen. There's no point in doing it if we are just offsetting local authority costs. So the group are very crystal clear. Local authorities must not reduce their budget in response to an ILF award being made, so that we can maintain this additionality for the benefit of the individual. And to be fair to all of our local authority colleagues, they absolutely bought into that principle. Last thing I want to highlight is the relationship with local authorities. ILF has only ever been accessed via applications made by social work, essentially. And again, that will continue when we reopen in April. Applications will be led by social workers who will complete a form online via an ILF portal that's really straightforward and won't take them much time at all to do. So those three things are all things that are really key critical things to the success in the reopening of the fund, but the group recognise that they're not perfect. There's many things in there that we'd like to change. The threshold sum in particular, we recognise that that's not the most sophisticated method for identifying those people who face the greatest barriers to independent living. So the working group have committed to continue to meet for at least a year after we reopen in April to help us develop better ways of evolving the reopened fund so that we can make it even better than it will be when it opens next week or 2 or 3. You'll notice I'm very carefully not saying a date, but it will be April. But we know we can make it better. We know there are improvements to be made, but we didn't want those improvements which would take more time to delay the reopening. So the decision was taken that we would reopen as soon as possible in April and then continue to work to develop and improve in the year ahead. So we recognise that the reopened ILF is not perfect, but we're really delighted that the group have agreed to keep meeting and to help us improve the fund and target the resources in a better way in the years ahead. And essentially to learn from the experience that we get once we reopen, because there are so many unknowns out there. So to conclude, I just want to recognise that the decision to reopen ILF was taken by the Scottish Government after 10 years of learning from the implementation of SDS Scotland Act, and it was taken in the midst of the creation of a national care service. Oh, I forgot about that bit. And a national care service, which actually the Feely review envisaged both SDS and ILF as being integral parts. So it's my hope that the day will come when SDS and ILF, as it was put by Feely in his review, will be as one, simply the way people are supported as part of a national care service with independent living at its heart, where having your needs met doesn't feel exceptional, and where nobody, least of all long-in-the-tooth disability rights activists like Jim, feel the need to say thank you. But I will say thank you to you, because that's me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. And I have to say that when part of the group, the process itself of the co-production was exemplary.
Thank you. Almost.
We've got time for a quick question for Peter, if anybody's got anything. Tressa?
Hi, thanks, Peter. That was absolutely brilliant and inspirational to hear. One of the things that we've been wondering as disabled people and the disabled people's organisations is that it's been mentioned about it being a phased approach to opening, and there being 9 million in the first year, and we're hoping that there's going to be an increase on that year on year, because we know that the need will be uncovered, and we might be slow to start spending it just because of how long it takes to set it all up. So I just wondered if you had any more information on that.
Good question, thanks, Tressa. So we don't know our year 2 budget. But you're right, it is a phased reopening, so that implies that it will grow over time. And if you think about it, our year 1 budget is £9 million, and if, and I touch wood, we manage to spend all of that in the first year, there will be inevitable growth in the second year, because if we spend that money in year 1, some people will start benefiting from the reopened fund in April coming. Some people won't benefit until next March. So on average, people who get ILF in the next year, on average, it will be a half-year cost that each person will be given. But all of those people in year 2 are full-year costs. So if we spend the 9 million in year 1, it will have to grow and grow quite significantly in year 2. And then, of course, we hope that there will be additional funding available for more people to join in year 2. So we don't have an allocation for year 2 and year 3, but it's definitely our expectation that it will grow. And if we hit the 1,000 in year 1, we will hope that that number of people benefiting from the fund grows in year 2 and 3 and onwards as well. One of the key focuses of the group, the co-production working group, and one of the reasons why so many compromises had to be made was because we need to make sure the fund is affordable and sustainable. Now, that's the compromise, as you know, Feely talks about needs-led. The reopening of ILF is a resource-led intervention, and the group understood that, and we're prepared to accept that, because it will benefit thousands of disabled people in the years to come. So that was a compromise that was accepted by the group in order to ensure its sustainability. Despite what people tell you, ILF UK closed round about the time of austerity kicking in. No coincidence there. It closed because of the cost primarily. And we don't want that to happen to the reopened fund in Scotland. So we are making compromises around affordability and sustainability to make sure we stay within budget and to make sure we're here for the benefit of people for as long as we possibly can.
Thanks very much, Tressa. Thanks, Peter. We're out of time now. There are questions that have come in online as well, so there's lots of interest in it. But thanks for now. Thanks very much, Peter.
Thank you.